I also know that for many people, the idea of being Christian is that maybe they somehow align with some notion of what is known as Christianity. And let me just say this, I'm not a fan of the word Christianity, and before I'm shot down for that, I don't believe that Jesus came to establish a religion. I believe that Jesus came to show us how to live, and to show us the way of life, and to give us life. And I think that's altogether something quite different. So we are the old ones out. We don't really fit into even the world's perception of religion. We are the people of God in Christ. We are His followers, we are His people, and we have a message to share in the world around us. We need leaders within congregations who will continue perpetually reminding us of who it is that we are. And we addressed a little bit of that in our last session, and there's too much more than we could have said, I understand that. But our faith in Christ is an evidence-based faith. What I mean by that is that there is a reason we believe what we believe. I believe there is a credible reason that we believe what we believe. And that though we may not be able to scientifically prove all that we believe, we recognize that the world that God created is bigger than science. We can say more of that if we need to do that at some point. And again, as before, if you have questions or whatever, that's something that doesn't make sense, you know what to do. Throw up your hand on whatever you do, and we'll talk about that. But everybody has faith. Everybody believes something. Even if they believe that what they believe is irrefutable fact, they actually only believe it. And we believe what we believe, and I believe there's good reason for us to believe that. So what I want us to do in this session is to look at what we're calling evidence. There we go. Historicity and resurrection of Christ. Some evidences of this. Jesus did many other things in the. There we go. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, writes John. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. So the principle here is that it is wholly reasonable to expect for there to be evidence to support the things that we believe. That's the premise of this. Is like John's. This is why I'm writing this. I'm writing this so that you believe. I'm writing this to provide evidence to substantiate your belief, so you understand what it is that God would have you believe. Just prior to this text, John records the encounter between Jesus and Thomas, which ends with Jesus saying, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed." So Thomas was looking for evidence to prove that Jesus had risen, and he saw. John is giving us evidence to persuade us that he is risen. And though we have not seen, we believe. Yep. So that is really the premise of this. Peter writes, what he should do, there we go. Peter writes that though you have not seen him, and so this would be very applicable to ourselves, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So our faith in Jesus as the Christ King, as the Son of God, is not to be a blind faith. It's not to be because, well, that's the way that I was raised. It's not to be because, well, I've always believed that, never really thought about it type of faith. We're not to simply believe because we feel that we should, or we've just simply always done that. Although for many of us, if we grew up with any notion of faith, at some point or another, that faith is going to be tested. And that's when we need to ask the questions. Why do you believe? Well, we're not going to look at every aspect, of course. We specifically wanted to look at the historicity of Jesus. There are numerous other arguments and lines of reasoning that we could pursue when looking at why we believe in the existence of God. And we may conclude that it's a lot easier to believe in the existence of God than in the non-existence of God. That is a very blind faith. But we're looking specifically here at the historicity of Christ. Different people are certainly going to be persuaded by different kinds of evidence. Some are very scientific in their pursuit of truth, or at least they claim to be. Some are very methodical in their assessment of evidence. And some are perhaps more creative and willing to recognize more subtle signs that lead us to believe. And I'm sure that there are examples of each one of those within this group here today. So maybe it could be a useful exercise for us to think about the sort of evidence that has led us to faith, or which has persuaded us that to believe in Jesus is a reasonable thing to do. So when we're looking to share our faith with others, I think we need to understand our audience, as it were, even if that audience is one single individual. And we need to recognize that everybody is different. Not everybody is going to be persuaded by the same sort of arguments, if you like, by the same sort of evidence. I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. We try to persuade an academic. We try to persuade, to lead an agnostic to faith. Are we sometimes relying too much upon scientific evidence, as it's commonly understood? When, of course, scientific evidence alone is really unable to substantiate matters which are, by definition, supernatural. God does not exist. He does not, or let me say, he's not confined to this three-dimensional physical realm in which we live. The idea of expecting science to prove the existence of God is really nonsensical, because God's the one who created science. God lives outside of any experimental realm. We're not able to put him in a test tube and say, yep, he's the one. It doesn't work in that way at all. Maybe we have our own changed life story, I hope we do, that bears witness to the power of Jesus to heal broken people by a faith that we have which is based upon evidence. We need to understand who it is that we're speaking to, and maybe we need to rediscover the evidence that has persuaded us to the point where we are now. So the existence of Jesus, let me begin by speaking about what I would consider to be incontrovertible evidence. The existence of Jesus is essentially an established historic fact. Are there some who will suggest otherwise? Of course there are. There are some who will suggest all host of ridiculous things. Of course there are. But the existence of Jesus is essentially an established historic fact. Professor Christopher Tuckett, who was the emeritus professor of New Testament studies at Pembroke College, so we know where he's coming from. He says all this does at least render highly implausible any far-fetched theories that even Jesus' very existence was a Christian invention. The fact that Jesus existed, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate for whatever reason, that he had a band of followers who continue to support his cause seems to be the bedrock. Seems to be part of the bedrock of historical tradition. If nothing else, the non-Christian evidence can provide us with some certainty on that score. So, not an invention by Christian, there is other evidence. So to turn to some of that other evidence, let's consider a number of other quotes, and you will excuse me perhaps that in the pursuit of looking at historical evidence, we need to look at some quotes. We need to look at what people have said and how they have understood what has been written in the past, and then we will look at some writings from ancient history supporting the historicity of Christ. So let's bring into the witness stand, if you like, a chap called Ken Dark. He's a British archaeologist. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. For some reason, I'm having a problem with expressing a few words today, and I don't know what it is. I'm going to put it down to the heat over the last few days, which has caused me to have far less sleep than I would normally have. Is that a reasonable excuse? Yes. Okay, thank you. Bear with me. Thank you. Okay, let's try this one again. Jolly good. I really don't normally have. So, yes, a British archaeologist, a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. I'm doing it again. Antiquaries of London, yes. He's and also of the Royal Historical Society and of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland, and a member of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So I'm giving you his credentials. He's the only person ever elected to all four of these learned societies. So in other words, he's well respected over quite a wide field. You know, that alone you could say whatever, but he's maybe worth listening to. He said this: "We can begin by asking the simple question, do we know that Jesus existed as a historical figure, rather than an invented person like James Bond or Superman?" Sorry for those of you, they're not real. Okay, that's the James Bond here. So, like almost all professional archaeologists and historians who've worked on the first century Holy Land, whatever their beliefs, I think the answer is certainly yes. Yes, he existed. Today, this chap is a biblical scholar, and I'm saying all of this to recognize that, sorry, the next chap I'm going to mention is a biblical scholar. And I think it's important that we understand the bias of anybody that we quote. Does that make sense? We need to be honest about this, okay? We all have a bias. Every one of us. Everybody you've ever heard speak on any subject has a bias. Some biases are very obvious. Some are quite subtle. And they might make you pay a license to watch their channels and others. But, you know, that everybody has a bias. And we need to be honest about what our bias might be. Okay, that's just simple, that's how it is. So this chap here, he's a biblical scholar. This is from his book, The Gospels in Jesus, a chap called Graham Stanton. He said, "Today, nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed and that the Gospels contain plenty of valuable evidence which is to be weighed and assessed critically. There's a general agreement that with the possible exception of Paul, we know far more about Jesus of Nazareth than about any first or second century Jewish or pagan religious teacher." And the evidence is there to demonstrate that. Another quote, this is from a chap called Bart Ehrman. You might have come across him. If you have, I'm slightly sorry. He was once an evangelical believer. He's now an atheist. There are reasons for that, but we're not going to delve into that. But this is what he has to say. So I've cited him here. Well, he's an academic humanist author. This is in his book, Did Jesus Exist? So he says, "Serious historians of the early Christian movement, all of them, have spent many years preparing to be experts in their field. Just to read the ancient sources requires expertise in a range of ancient languages, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, often Aramaic, Syriac and Coptic, not to mention the modern languages of scholarship, for example, German and French. And that's just for starters. Expertise requires years of patiently examining ancient texts and a thorough grounding in the history and culture of Greek and Roman antiquity. The religions of the ancient Mediterranean world, both pagan and Jewish, knowledge of the history of the Christian church and the development of the social life of theology, and, well, lots of other things. It is striking that virtually everyone who has spent all the years needed to attain these qualifications is convinced that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. Okay, we're saying the same over and over again, and we could cite other sources, other quotes, other experts, and call them whatever you will. But nobody seriously denies that he existed as an historical figure. The evidence that we will look at in a moment is really overwhelming in that. Ehrman here agrees that the evidence demonstrates the historicity of Jesus. He believes that he existed. He no longer believes in him anymore. And so any person who persists in denying his existence, the existence of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, they're either clearly prejudiced, willfully ignorant, or in denial of reality, along with virtually every historical figure of the past. If you're going to deny the historical reality of Jesus, you might as well deny the historical reality of any other ancient character. And so it's also important to say, as we think about evidences, I might develop this a bit later, but it's important to say that the Gospels are true in what they record about Jesus, not because secular witnesses and external evidences say so, but because God has said so by breathing out his words. Now, I think we can accept that on the basis that we believe in God, we believe in the work of the Spirit of God in revealing his words. So that's one of our biases. One of our biases is that we believe that God is and that he has done X, Y, and Z. So I think it's important for us to recognize that our faith is not based upon the evidences provided by modern day experts and other witnesses. It's based upon the work of God through his Spirit. Does that make some sense? I think that's important. Okay, let's take a look at some ancient historians. And the first one we're going to look at is Tacitus, or Tacitus if you prefer. This is one of those ongoing discussions. How do we do the Latin C? Anyway, we'll call him Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus, to be precise. And of course, that's exactly what he looked like. Right, he was a Roman historian who lived through the reigns of over half a dozen Roman emperors, considered by some to be the greatest historian of ancient Rome. He's generally acknowledged for his moral integrity and essential goodness. He's best known for two significant works, the Annals and the Histories, consisting of some 30 books. His Annals, they cover the period from the death of Augustus to that of Nero. His Histories begin after Nero's death, good, and proceed to the end of the reign of Domitian in AD 96. So he records at least one reference to Christ and two to early Christians, one in each of his major works. So the following is from his Annals, written around about AD 115, in which he writes concerning the great fire in Rome during the reign of Nero. I don't know if any of you here, some of you have, I know, been following along on our Thursday evening online Bible classes with the British Bible School. We've just concluded a series. Steve Whitehead has been leading us on a series looking at the Roman Empire in the New Testament, and certainly Nero is mentioned, and the great fire of Rome. So this is what Tacitus has to say. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. So the thing is, Nero is being found out. I mean, this is obviously not anything that would happen in modern day Britain, but Nero, as a man in with supreme authority, had ordered, basically, he was responsible for the Great Fire of Rome. And so he tried to pin the blame on somebody else. I mean, so thankfully politicians today would never do anything like that. But that's, nothing's changed. The world is just the same as ever it was, you know. And we see it here. And so who is he going to pin the blame on? It's the Christians. That was it. Christus, from whom the name had its origin. Oh yes, sorry, I forgot. I did continue with the quote. Christus, he says, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. And then continuing, accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burned to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. And here Tacitus is writing of our brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus. This is just horrific, is it not? They were the scapegoats that Nero had chosen in order to try to shift the blame from himself. But in all of this, and Tacitus, he's not a believer himself. This is quite evident. So he's recording very much as a third party the events that took place, and speaks of Christus and of those who followed him. And Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle. He was exhibiting a show in the circus, which he mingled when he was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So that is the quote there from Tacitus from his Annals. So there's a number of facts that are corroborated here within this quote. One is that the believers were known as Christians after their founder, Christus. Christ was put to death by the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, and this happened during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. Following the apparent suppression of this superstition, as he calls it, it broke out again in Judea and beyond as far as Rome. So there is tacit evidence here of resurrection, in as much as, Tacitus does not specifically explain this, but we understand from the biblical record why this didn't die, why the movement didn't die, because Jesus rose from the dead, and the news of that spread widely, as we saw in our earlier session, throughout the world. It became known very far and wide. So there were, during the reign of Nero, believers living in Rome. Many of these were tortured, crucified, or burned to death. Others simply, and then the others, even other criminals, had compassion upon them, realizing that the persecution was simply to satisfy one man's cruelty. Tacitus must have received this information from an earlier source, which may well have been the official imperial records, to which he was certainly privy. Having just quoted from Tacitus, it's likely that no one of us, and many would not doubt the genuineness of what he is purported to have written. And why would you? If you are a student of the classics, if you're a student of ancient history, particularly that of ancient Rome, you will be reliant upon the words of Tacitus. They would be treated virtually as gospel, we might say. That this is obviously what happened in ancient Rome. But the first 6 books of his annals survive in only one manuscript, which was copied about 700 years later, and yet nobody doubts its authenticity. Think of that. The first 6 books of his annals survive in one manuscript, copied about 700 years after they were written. I mean, that's hardly overwhelming textual support. We'll talk about some of those issues later this afternoon, Lord willing. Nobody doubts, everybody's willing to accept it. In contrast, the writings of the New Testament scriptures are the most authenticated documents in the world. There's every good reason to take them at face value. So I'm going to show you a couple of charts here. One of them will show the years from the original writing to the first known copy. So it's obviously graphic. There's a chart. There we go. So look, we've got what Tacitus, he's up there, and how many years after the first copy, and look at all of this, and here you look, the records of Plato, Caesar, his Gallic wars and what have you, Pliny, Suetonius, will come back in later, Aristotle, these great figures of the past, whose works shape our knowledge and understanding of ancient history. Look how many years there were between when they were first written and the first copies that we have of their works. And then you look at the New Testament. It's minimal. Written so very close to the events, which will generally suggest they're more likely to be more reliable. Yeah? If somebody was to write your life history 700 years from now, well, maybe with the digital record that we all leave behind, they might have a pretty good idea. But if you were to try to write a history of an ancestor of yours who lived 700 years ago, we would greatly struggle, I'm sure. So we understand. Now, look, I'm going to show another chart which shows the number of witnesses of these documents. And there's quite a contrast here. Plato 7, Tacitus 20, Caesar 10, and on. Come to the New Testament, well, I mean, I just put 5,000, but it's well in excess of 5,000. And we'll substantiate that a little bit later, perhaps. Okay. So the evidence supporting the text of the New Testament, both in terms of how short a time after the events happened and when the first documents were written, and the number of documents that bear witness, is that there's quite an extensive contrast that I think is worthy to be considered. Okay, let's move to another chap here, a chap called Suetonius. There he is. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus was another Roman historian writing around the same time as Tacitus. Chief secretary of the Emperor Hadrian, the chap who built his wall, not terribly far north, there we go. He had access to the imperial records. His most important work was De Vita Caesarum, which is more commonly known as the 12 Caesars. Some of you might have read it. You may have a copy on your bookshelves, and again you may not. But he makes one reference to Jesus and another to Christians. The following quote is from his section looking at Claudius, however you want to do his name, where he says, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from the city. Suetonius refers to a series of riots which broke out in a large Jewish community in Rome in the year AD 49. As a result, the Jews were banished from the city, an event that's corroborated by Luke in the book of Acts, chapter 18. The second reference from Suetonius is from his writings concerning Nero. After the great fire, he says, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. We possess a mischievous religious belief. Actually, many people would consider that to be true. Maybe they wouldn't use that same word, but they'd certainly consider us to be rather strange, unusual, suspicious perhaps, because of the things that we believe. Because the kingdom of God is so very different from the kingdoms of this world. There's a number of facts that are here. Going to, at this time, Pliny the Younger, the Emperor Trajan, even the Emperor Hadrian, we're not going to. I want us to look very briefly at some Jewish sources. And I don't think I need to say that on the whole, Jewish sources are not going to be favourable towards Jesus as Messiah. So they're certainly not going to want to be supportive of the claims that he made. So firstly, I want to consider briefly the Talmud. And we might ask, well, what is it? Well, that's a good question. It is the official collection of Jewish traditions handed down through generations. It's a record of rabbinic discussions pertaining to Jewish law, ethics, customs, and history. I doubt if any of us here has the Talmud on their bookshelves, but the most common editions would take up about this much space. And if you were a Jewish scholar, if you were a rabbi, you would be very familiar with the contents of those volumes. It's made up of two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. Originally, the Mishnah was purely in oral form. We find Jesus referring to the traditions of the elders. He's referring to what later was written down within Mishnah. And the Jews allege that this had been given to Moses by God, but they alleged incorrectly. But that's another matter. In Matthew chapter 15, as an example, the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem, said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They do not wash their hands when they eat." He said, "Why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition?" So there is a direct conflict that we find recurring throughout the Gospels between Jesus and the religious leaders of the Jews. It was committed to writing no later than AD 200. Some of the Gemara is certainly later. But the Talmud was essentially regarded as their second law. And many times it became even more important. So I think we're doing okay, just hold tight. We've got a few more minutes. The Talmud is divided into 6 major books, known as Sidirim, or orders. Each of these contain between 7 and 12 tractates, 63 in total. Each of these is divided. Basically, it is a very, if you have significant trouble sleeping at night, you may want to read through the Talmud. It's freely accessible online. I'm being a little naughty when I say to you. Seriously, it can become very laborious, but it can also be extremely fascinating in understanding the mind of the religious Jews. And it's also disturbing when I hear some of the things that I have heard over the years that have come from the mouth of those who profess to be followers of Jesus, who treat his words in the same way that the likes of the Pharisees treated the law of Moses. I'm not going to elaborate terribly on it. Let me just give a brief quote. Let me just elaborate very briefly on this. You're familiar with the way in which Jesus, on a number of occasions, was accused of violating the Sabbath. He didn't, he never did, but he was accused of that. He was accused of that because within Talmud, there was a section that explores the Sabbath, and there's a list of 39 activities which were prohibited. So that the Torah simply says you don't work. The Jewish rabbi said, well, what does it mean not to work? And so they came up with a list of 39 things specifically forbidden. Each of those was further subdivided. It does become laborious, but it's fascinating. For example, on the Sabbath, you could not drag a chair along the ground. The reason for that is that your floor was not carpeted or tiled. It would have been a dirt floor. If you'd have dragged your chair across the ground, it would have formed a rut. If a seed fell into that rut, you would therefore be guilty of ploughing. Seriously. Okay, don't we laugh when we think how absolutely ridiculous. And that kind of thinking is repeated over and over and over and over again, along with loopholes in order to get around what it is that God had said. So it's very intricate. If you're a lawyer, I'm sure you're a very good lawyer, and you'll be familiar with the idea of loopholes, of trying to read things and twist things, and that's exactly what the religious, I'm not saying anybody here would do that, of course, but I'm saying that was the mindset of the religious leaders. Now, within all of that, and the reason I wanted to mention this, and I've said more than I should have done already, there's a quote here. I'm just going to read the quote without giving particular context. On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, this is speaking of Jesus, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favour, let him come forward and plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favour, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Well, there's a number of facts which are corroborated here. One, the death of Jesus by crucifixion. Hanged, that was implied. One of the criminals who were hanged, Luke tells us, railed at him, so that same word is used even within the Gospels. And of course, Paul speaks about cursing, about Christ being cursed for having been hanged on a tree. Okay, so that's certainly speaking of the same thing. The timing of the event on the eve of the Passover, some delay between a decision to execute and the execution, the judgment of sorcery and enticement to apostasy, and the lack of defense seem to certainly corroborate what we find within the Gospels. No, let's not do that. Okay, that's going to take too much time. I've lost my cursor again. Is it on the screen there? No, come here. Oh, there it is. Okay, I need this. Right, let's not do that. Let's have a look at some other Greek sources, I think so. Oh, sorry, other Gentile sources, Greek sources. Okay, let's look at that very briefly here. Lucian of Samosata, 2nd century Greek writer, in his satirical letter to passing Peregrine, Lucian wrote derisively of Jesus and early Christians. So somebody, again, obviously opposed to the way of Christ, but in their opposition is giving us evidence that he existed. Okay, and this is what he says. This writing is probably, this writing is probably the earliest reference to Jesus by a pagan writer. His purpose in writing this was to criticize Christians for being such gullible people, with little reason, that they would approve charlatans who pose as teachers, supporting them even to the point of making them wealthy. So he was obviously very cynical in his outlook and found whatever reason he could to criticize. He said, look, people haven't changed. Okay, the same mindset persists within people today. The quote, the Christians, and worship a man, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they're all brothers from the moment they're converted, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. What terrible accusations. So there we go. Thank you, Lucian. A number of facts are corroborated here by him in this. Jesus was worshipped by Christians. Jesus introduced new teachings. Palestine, the location is given in another unquoted portion. Jesus was crucified because of these teachings. He taught all believers, they were brothers and sisters. This new relationship began from the moment of conversion. Christians denied the false gods of Greece and they practiced their faith, disregarding material possession, holding common property among themselves. Absolutely. I mean, what a great endorsement. You know, but when your enemies speak out, they may have, they may be unwittingly, providing the evidence that you need. And so this is rather fascinating. And I'm going to close, if I may. I've got about -1 minute left. But I'm going to quote by referring to Mara bar Serapion. I know his name just rolls off the tongue. The British Library holds the manuscript of a letter written sometime between the late 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Its author was a Syrian named Mara bar Serapion, who was writing from prison to motivate his son Serapion to emulate wise teachers of the past. Okay, so it's a pretty early document, and this is what he says. What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their king? Jesus, it's an ambiguous part of the manuscript. It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. God justly avenged these three men. The Jew ruined and driven from their land, living complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statute of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. So again, a number of facts corroborated here by Mara bar Serapion. Jesus was considered to be a wise and virtuous man. He's twice addressed as the king of the Jews, possibly a reference to Jesus' own teaching about himself, maybe the wording placed over his head on the cross. He was executed unjustly by the Jews, who paid for the misdeeds by suffering judgment soon afterwards, probably at least a reference to the fall of Jerusalem for the Roman armies in AD 70. And Jesus lived on in the teachings of the early Christians, an indictment that Mara bar Serapion was almost certainly not a Christian himself. And yet he recognizes Jesus as this great teacher. And on that point, we will bring this session to a close. I hope that's been of some interest. I'll make the slides available so that you can have the quotes if you would like to do that, of course. Any questions, any comments, any observations before we wrap up this session? Okay. Well, you've been terribly well behaved. I haven't. Shall I pass over? You can take from now? Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. And you made the comments about Tacitus.
Yes.
Right. Now, it's not unheard of for the same person to make a speech presented at another meeting and slightly modify that speech. So the two, the one from the Arabic source.
Oh, this is the Josephus. Sorry,
This
is the Josephus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could have been both equally valid.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Knowing Josephus, I mean not personally, but knowing Josephus, knowing his Jewish origins, even though he was happy to blame the Jews for their insurrection against the Romans, but he kind of had to do that because he was now, in the pocket of Vespasian, the empire. He was a politician. He was always looking for the winning side. Initially as a Pharisee supporting his Jewish people, but then he realized, hold on a minute, right, I'm gonna go over to the other side. So you're absolutely correct. I mean, it is plausible. But the argument from the Arabic source is stronger I think because it has not been preserved near to the possibility of Christian influence. And I think there's generally a good policy, and it's something that we need to think about when we consider evidences. Don't allow a weak argument to undermine the strong. So I would be happy to acknowledge that the more favourable quote from Josephus may very well have been tampered with. So let's just look at the quote that is almost certainly not being tampered with, and that provides stronger evidence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Even though it may not be exactly what we wanted to say. I think it makes sense that some early Christian scribe thought, say, oh, we'll pop this in here, it'll lend a little bit more weight to our argument, and it probably did to many, but that wouldn't have been entirely honest, let's say. I mean, it would have been,
That brings me to a very important advice given to me by a brother many decades ago. And he says there are times as Christians we should stand back from the arguments we presented and hear ourselves again. And there are instances we would want to distance ourselves from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have been in situations where I have taught something. I'm thinking of a particular incident which took place back in the early 80s, and it was quite profound. And I'd been teaching something, and I came away thinking, really, that didn't make sense. That didn't. It was not consistent with, and so we changed. And of course, subsequently, yes, there are things that I've come to see differently, and that can only really happen, I think, through healthy self-reflection. Listen to ourselves, as you say. Step back, listen to ourselves, and how would I react to this? How might this affect me if I was standing in the other person's shoes? Very, very useful. Thank you. Excellent. Jolly good. So I'm going to hand over to you now and say thank you all. I'm going to unplug that. Oh, there we go. Pop it there.